They had written stable in the chart. They had smiled at the parents and moved on. In the lull between rounds, amid the hum of machines and the smell of antiseptic that never left the corners of the ward, one pair of eyes kept returning to the tiny chest that rose and fell in irregular half-breaths. He had been trained to notice things no one else thought mattered. He noticed the way a fingertip went pale before it came back to pink. He noticed the small, almost apologetic silence of a monitor that skipped a beat and then pretended nothing had happened.
Administrative efficiency hung like a neon thread. Turnover, throughput, discharge. No one blamed the hospital for wanting beds available. No one blamed the doctors for trusting their tests. But Daniel had learned early that systems were excellent at smoothing edges. They were awful at catching the fine hairline faults. He reviewed Leela's file again and again. Normal labs, normal APGAR, nothing flagged. Still, the monitor's graph, when you squinted, had a small notch at 0830, a half-formed valley at 0903, and then a cluster of tiny perturbations at 0154 during nursing rounds. To a casual glance, nothing. To him, a pattern. Patterns were his trade. "She's doing fine," Dr. Harris had said in the doorway, neatly folding the ends of a conversation for everyone. He had the sort of smile that suggested there were bigger houses to visit. "Early term, feeding well. We'll keep her for observation and discharge tomorrow." Daniel opened his mouth. He had learned to speak in tacks and nails. "Her sat stipped twice in the last hour. I wrote it down." He kept his voice steady. He didn't want the word concern to sound like accusation. Dr. Harris glanced at the monitor, then at the nurse's notes, one scrap of handwriting against a landscape of printed results. "Transient dips happen. Watch and report if they persist, Daniel." Persuasion by a polished coat. He walked away with the smooth authority of someone whose decisions met no resistance. The nurse watched him go and felt the old smallness settle again. She would be invisible if she did not insist. There is an awkward calculus nurses learn at the bedside: when to escalate and risk the label of anxious, when to hold your ground and invite ridicule, when to record a claim that will disappear into the clean paper of a chart. Daniel thought of his mother, of nights spent listening for the faint cough that presaged fever, and of every patient he'd kept in a corner where no one thought to look. He thought of the ache in the voice of Leela's father, Owen, a man whose hands were still shaking even when he smiled. That ache pulled him into action. He called a resident on duty, a young woman with bright, watchful eyes, Nina Patel, who liked order and asked good questions. "Nina, can you run a repeat bedside oxygen check and maybe an extra reading before handoff? I'm getting recurrent dips." "Artifact is more likely than pathology," she said carefully, "but sure, I'll do a quick check." They stood together by the crib while the machine sang its monotone song. Neon lights hummed. Occasionally, they were punctured by a lullaby from the pediatric meds dispenser, a short, canned melody that made Daniel feel like someone had put a small radio inside time to remind him it was all normal. At 0116, the monitor fell. Not a ghostly blip this time, but a more deliberate ladder down, a fall from 96 to 88 to 81 in heart-stopping meter-long breaths. Daniel's muscles remembered before thought arrived.
He had been trained for emergencies, small and large, intubation, chest compressions, the choreography of scaled panic. But this was more delicate. This was about return, not force. He watched the numbers and felt something like cold oil spread across his knuckles. He placed a hand lightly on Leela's chest. Her breathing was shallow, and there was that color, like an old photograph left too long in sun, washing across her cheek. The resident's face tightened, the look of someone who had just been handed a question she could not answer with confidence. "Stimulate," Nina said. Her voice had a practiced firmness, a perception widened by medical school, but not yet hardened into cynicism. Daniel tapped Leela's soles with his fingers, an instinct as old as the first midwives. He repositioned, head slightly extended, the chin lift he had performed 1,000 times for rebreathing newborns. He kept talking to her, because words are scaffolding for the small ones who lose rhythm. "Easy. Come back. Come back, sweetheart." He eased the oxygen mask under the edge of blanket, not gloved in grim theatricality, but careful, hand steady. He adjusted the flow in shallow steps, enough to nudge, not enough to frighten. A nurse manager, passing the station, shot him a look that read as a question. "Are we escalating?" Daniel shook his head minutely. Not yet. Documentation mattered. Timing mattered. If he was wrong, he could be a cautionary tale. If he was right, the charts would need to explain the inches he had worked. The machine responded sluggishly. Numbers rose a touch. Leela coughed once, a small corrective sound, and then breathed, as if she had only been pretending for a moment to forget how. The monitor sighed upward to 93, then steadied. Daniel exhaled in a way that his chest remembered was allowed. "She had an episode," Nina said, low, to the empty room. But the attending was already somewhere else, armed with schedules and ultrasound orders, in a morning meeting that demanded his presence.
There was pressure, always, to keep the flow of patients onward. Transfers, discharge summaries, beds to open. Systems that reward speed can suffocate attention. Daniel wrote the times into his notebook again, hands moving with a deliberate economy. He clipped the monitor graph with his phone camera, something not all nurses trusted, but a small visual is a stubborn thing when memory is questioned. He recorded Leela's skin tone in the margin with shorthand and left the page open on the nurse's station like a quiet altar. Somewhere behind the fluorescent glass, a woman sobbed into a tissue, and a man prayed in a chair with hands that trembled. Owen poked his head into the nursery doorway, eyes searching for explanation. Daniel turned, meeting those eyes like a promise he had not yet earned. "She's okay now," he said, choosing words that were small bastions. There was a drop. We stimulated, gave low-flow oxygen. She responded.
"We'll keep monitoring." Owen's face loosened in a way that made Daniel imagine a dam breaking under tons of hidden water. "Thank you," he said, and his voice caught. Daniel wanted to say more, to tell of the pattern, the dips before midnight, the odd cooling of a fingertip, the way the rhythm sometimes dissynced. But there were reasons to gather every piece of evidence, reasons shaped by years of seeing judgment arrive before facts did. He knew the risk of being the one voice alone in a room full of resumes, so he collected, and he waited. In the hours that followed, staff rotated like seasons. A new nurse took the evening watch. A junior doctor made rounds with a tablet and a brisk nod. The monitor blipped often, small murmurs of instability that, to some, were either noise or normal newborn behavior. To Daniel, every blip was a predicate. He followed them like a trail of footprints in fresh snow. There are small rituals only nurses know, the secret folding of a blanket in a way a baby likes, the art of positioning a thermoregulator to even the tiny chest's cadence, the precise manner of holding a newborn for the first bath so the startle reflex stays kind. Daniel moved through these rituals with the quiet competence of someone who had chosen to be faithful to small things. He had not come to the job for recognition. The years had taught him the other currency, trust, the trust of parents and the trust of infants who he could soothe. By dawn, the nursery smelled of toast and disinfectant, the light returning slow and hesitant. Dr. Harris walked in again, this time with a coffee and the morning team's optimism. He scanned the board, read the notes, and everything seemed fine in the way a report is fine. "Discharge planning for noon," he announced. "Good work, everyone." Daniel watched him and felt a tightness in the back of his throat. Noon would mean taking Lila out of the observation pool and into a car seat without the slow grace of long watch. It would mean a family returning home with the knowledge that their child had been given a clean bill. It would mean trust. He set the small notebook down and made another entry. 0506, smaller dips continued. 0116 event, stimulated, responded, photo saved. Recommend extended observation, consult resp team if dips continue. He could write it and there would be a record, but records don't always move decision makers, so he did the only other thing he could think to do. He went to find someone with leverage who listened without wearing the armor of certainty. He found nurse manager Sloan at the station, a woman with silver hair pulled tight and a gaze that measured risk in calendar months. "Sloan, I need to flag Lila Blake for an extended observation," he said. "She had recurrent oxygen dips overnight and an episode at 0116. She responded to stimulation, but I'm worried about discharge at noon." Sloan's brows lifted. "She's been stable since," she said.
We can't keep every newborn overnight on presumption. Beds are tight. Bed turnover is important, Daniel agreed. So is not sending a family home with a near miss. I can keep detailed observations every 30 minutes and bring an extra sat reading to rounds. Sloan watched him, then looked at the open notebook. "You've documented everything?" she asked. "Recorded, and I have a screenshot of the graph." Sloan's expression thawed a fraction. "Okay, document, and I'll flag the case in the handoff. If you get another dip, call me immediately and we'll call the senior for a consult." It was not the triumphant permission Daniel would have liked. It was a concession. It was a small procedural victory. He returned to the crib, satisfied enough to be dangerous. There is a peculiar solitude in guarding a life. It is not heroism so much as fidelity. Daniel inventoried it in small actions. An extra blanket tucked in the crook of Leela's legs, a tiny mitten smoothed so it wouldn't snag, the gentle murmur of lullaby into a room that had been numbed by exhaustion. He read the monitor as if it were weather, wind shifting left to right, pressure building, and a storm possibly on the way. He did not want storms, he wanted to prevent them.
Mid-morning, an unfamiliar pair of hands swept into the nursery. A nurse from postpartum came to collect a bassinet for transfer. The usual rhythm of the hospital pressed against Daniel's caution like a tide against a sandcastle. He had a meeting with the respiratory nurse in 15 minutes, and he had called a junior consult just to keep things formal. But momentum favored the discharge. At 10:34, the monitor made a sound that is not often described but is remembered. The alarm went thin and broken, more like a question than an imperative. Daniel and Nina were both at the bedside within heartbeats. The numbers were not flashing red long, just a steady drop, now to 78. Leela's limbs were lax at the edges, and a faint grayness had stained her lips. For a suspended second, they all hesitated. Hesitation is a dangerous thing in hospitals. It eats time. Daniel felt the old conflict rise. The fear of being wrong in front of colleagues versus the fear of being complacent in the face of a small life. He had not come to be famous. He had come to be faithful. So he moved. Daniel adjusted Leela's position, pulled the blanket back, and breathed into the rhythm of the mattress. His hands were confident because they had been worn by experience, not because he wanted acknowledgement. He rubbed her sternum with the heel of his hand and spoke softly. "Come on, love. Come back to us." The gesture was simple. The effect was immediate. A tiny gasp, a convulsive inhale, and then the monitor began its slow climb. Nina shouted over the beeping for oxygen and for a call to the code card, a standard move when a neonate shows a significant drop.
Others swarmed, all in motion and all responding to the scene Daniel had held like a fragile glass. Dr. Harris, returning, took one look and then allowed himself a brief staccato of instructions, not to blame, but to corral the room. Someone reached for the suction bulb, someone adjusted the oxygen, someone checked IV lines. The choreography was practiced, but the thing that had made it possible, the minute-by-minute record, the screenshot Daniel had on his phone, the timing recorded in his notebook, was his invisible scaffolding. His notes pointed the hands where they needed to go. Lila's chest rose, then fell. The numbers nudged up and then found a new, shakier plateau. The atmosphere in the room changed from raw panic to concentrated work. Owen and Rosa stood outside the glass, hands pressed to the transparent barrier as if they could be there and not there at once. Their mouths formed questions that no one could hear. When the immediate crisis ended, an end in the hospital is a pause before the next test. Daniel's body felt as if it had run a long distance. He could taste metal at the back of his teeth, the residue of adrenaline. The senior resident scribbled into a clipboard. A respiratory therapist requested a consult. Dr. Harris's voice softened when he addressed Daniel. Good, quick recognition. It was not praise in the way Daniel wanted. It was practical and restrained. It allowed the world to remain functional. But the shift had changed. Discharge at noon was no longer a given. The documentation sat like a small beam of light on a table. They could not simply sweep it away. A review would be scheduled. A respiratory consult would read the monitor strip and frown. The hospital liked neat narratives. This was now not only a story of a newborn, but a story of vigilance. Daniel washed his hands slowly, and with the kind of tenderness he reserved for the smallest patients, smoothed Lila's blanket. He took out his phone and reopened the photograph of the monitor's graph. He would upload it to the chart, but first he sent a copy to Nina with a single line. Keep this with the chart. We had an episode at 01:16 and again at 10:34. The overnight shift turned to day, and day brought daylight scrutiny. Conversations that had been murmured behind doors reassembled at the nurses' station with new shapes. The unit's director called for more detailed notes. The respiratory team asked questions that implied nothing accusatory, but suggested that they would be digging through other charts for patterns. Daniel watched these movements with a mixture of relief and worry. He had done what he could. The institutional engine would now apply its levers and pulleys. In the hallway, Owen found him, eyes red-rimmed and raw. "Are you the one who kept watching?" he asked. Daniel's first instinct was to deflect. He had always been the kind of person who let the patient be at the center.
But Owen's gratitude was the kind that had no angles, and Daniel accepted it like a quiet debt. "You kept her breathing," Owen said. She did the work," Daniel replied, because he could not take the whole credit from a breathing body that fought back. "I just didn't let her do it alone." They stood there, two people in a massive machine that had both failed and saved. There would be interviews and perhaps a review, and potentially a meeting with administration. There would be words about anomaly, about transient events. There would be the inevitable question of whether the nurse had been right to resist the current of routine. These things would be decided in rooms of paper and voices that debated precedents. Daniel returned to the station and found his notebook still open. He had crossed the entries in black ink and left the timestamps neat. He tucked it into his scrub pocket like a talisman. His badge, dulled by time, scratched lightly against the cloth. He had been invisible most of his career, and tonight he had been visible in a way he was not certain he wanted. Across the courtyard, the sun rose higher and threw a blade of light into the nursery window. It caught the tiny hospital bracelet on Leela's wrist and made it glint like a small flag. She slept now, exhausted but breathing in longer, more even beats. Outside, the world chewed through headlines and commuter stress and the city's small cruelties. Inside, a parent's hand curled around a tiny mitten. Daniel watched the scene and felt relief's bittersweetness. The immediate danger had passed, but the greater questions, how the system nearly let a life slip, how invisible attention sometimes saves the day, were still blindfolded in meetings and reviews to come. He wasn't interested in a ceremony. He had no need for plaques. He wanted the ledger to reflect what had happened, and for small gestures like extra observation to be taken seriously. He wanted the hospital to value patience as much as speed. And he wanted parents to feel that somebody who would see what others missed, had been there when it counted. A nurse's shift is made up of these small reconciliations between policy and intuition, between efficiency and safety, between being seen and doing the unseen work. Daniel understood the politics, the human reluctance to admit error, the way institutions can prioritize throughput over tenderness. He had seen it before. Tonight he had decided to be where the quiet decisions are made. The day shifted into a bustle of new rounds, families moving, forms signed. Doctors came and went with their sealed confidence. Somewhere, in an administrative office, someone would ask questions about handoff procedure, and bed management, and chart clarity. Daniel imagined the conversation like a series of doors, each one opening into another room of careful speaking. He had the notes. He had the screenshot. He had Nina's corroboration, and a father's gratitude.
It would be enough to force a conversation. Still, there was a small unease that did not leave him. The night had been longer than the record suggested. He remembered with a clarity that made his chest ache the freshman night when a mother had thanked him with a trembling voice, and he had felt like a thief taking credit for a miracle that was not his. Tonight felt similar, but quieter and less public. There would be a review board, perhaps a commendation, perhaps a memo. None of that mattered the same way as the pink rose of a newborn's cheek. Around noon, as families shuffled and the hospital's gears shifted toward the practicalities of life beyond the ward, Dr. Harris convened a brief meeting at the foot of Lila's crib. He spoke in pragmatic tones about extended observation, about a consult, about documenting the events. He did not need to say that if the small notebook had not existed, the path would have been different. Daniel listened as if the conversation were a map being drawn, where before there had been only fog. He kept his hands folded, his expression even. The room smelled faintly of formula and the stale coffee of those convinced of long days ahead. There was no applause, only the measured ticking of policy finding its feet. When the group dispersed, Daniel remained by the crib a moment longer. He smoothed the blanket that had been rumpled by rescue and found tucked beneath the pillow a tiny drawing, crayon lines and the tentative hand of a child who must have visited, perhaps a sibling in waiting. Someone had left it as a thank you, or perhaps it was a result of an earlier shift. Either way, it felt like a small human light. He slipped the drawing into his pocket. It was an anchor against the days where invisibility felt too heavy. He folded the corner of his notebook and made one final note for the morning. Recommend 24-hour telemetry and consults. Family aware. Monitor strip saved. There was an unspoken recognition in the staff's faces now. The memory of a close call had settled like dust, and dust can both clean and cloud. Some would forget, some would remember. Daniel did not need their memory to survive. He needed the institution to learn. He left the nursery briefly to refill his coffee and to sit with the posture of someone who had held a life in his hands. He thought of his own son, far away in school, of the small things his child did that made Daniel's heart untidy with pride. He imagined Rosa and Owen bring home with new knowledge and a trembling sense of how easy danger can be when it's done quietly. When he returned, the nurse manager called him aside. "We need a detailed report by 4 p.m., she said, "and make sure everything is in the chart. The director will review it." Daniel nodded. It felt like an ordinary instruction, and yet it carried the weight of consequence. He took a breath and went back to the crib where the tiny hand twitched in sleep, the hairline a soft dark halo. He touched the blanket to ensure it lay flat,
that the bracelet was secure, that every fold fit the way tenderness prefers. There were some things the hospital could fix with policy and procedure. There were other things that required the patience of people willing to keep watching. He had kept watching. Tonight proved that watching could make the difference between a homecoming and a memorial. That thought sat in him both bitter and blessed. He sat down for a moment at the nurse's station and checked his phone for messages. A little further down the corridor, someone had posted a notice for Staff Appreciation Week, small indulgences to keep morale when the days are long. He smiled at the irony. A plaque would mean less than the conversations he hoped to have at the next staff meeting, about taking an extra reading, about listening to monitors like weather, about trusting the odd notes in the margin. By early afternoon, Lila slept with the evenness of a storm that had passed but left the sky clouded. The team had agreed to keep her overnight for observation and to have a respiratory consult in the morning. That was more than Daniel had expected when the night began. He breathed a sigh that tasted like the relief of a watchman who had not been dismissed. He rose and straightened his badge. He had not sought to be seen. He would not demand accolades. He would, however, insist that the record reflect the truth. Outside the nursery, the world moved in its habitual indifference. Inside, a father sat with clasped hands, and a mother slept finally. A tiny bracelet recorded a name. A notebook held a timeline. A photograph of a monitor graph lay waiting to become part of the official story. Daniel walked back into the light of the ward, his silhouette small against the enormous apparatus of the hospital. He had been invisible for most of his life, and that invisibility had not been a failure, but a practice. Tonight, it had been the difference. And yet, as he turned to take up his next patient, there was the soft, inevitable knowing that some stories do not end with the saving. There will be meetings, reviews, explanations that are careful in particular. There will be people who ask why the patterns were not caught earlier. There will be logic that seeks to make a clean line through a messy night. He tucked his notebook back into his pocket and straightened his shoulders. There was work to do. There would be a conversation with administration and the respiratory team. There would be a family meeting, where Owen and Rosa would be told more about what had happened and what might happen. Daniel hoped, without fanfare, that the small acts of attention he had given would reshape the next patient's fate in ways that did not require heroism, but required presence. Before he moved to the next assignment, he found a quiet corner and placed his palm over Lila's tiny mitten for a single beat.
It was a private moment, neither proclamation nor prayer, only a silent witness to what careful watching can do. If these stories mean anything, he thought, it is that invisibility is not emptiness. It is a reservoir. It is where the work that saves people quietly accumulates. One observation, one note, one timed intervention. He had always known that. Tonight, the ledger agreed. If you believe in the quiet courage of people who go unseen, stay with these stories. They are where the ordinary becomes extraordinary. For now, the ward settled into a different rhythm. The immediate danger had been pulled back from the edge. The family slept closer to home, and the hospital's machinery hummed on. There would be time for review, for charts to be parsed, and for the administrative language to meet the night's human texture. Daniel gathered his things and prepared for a handover that would carry the night's truth into daylight. He walked past the windows where the city had resumed its ordinary pace. He thought of his notebook, with its small, stubborn truth, and of the photograph waiting to be attached to the chart. He thought of the parents' gratitude, fragile and enormous at once. He thought of the way a tiny hand could change the motion of a whole life. Behind him, in the nursery, a monitor beeped with a gentle certainty. Leela's chest rose and fell. The tiny mitten lay on a folded blanket like a token. The system was moving toward review. The story was far from over. The story was far from over. By late afternoon, the nursery had taken on the look of a place recovering from a storm. Surfaces wiped down, the hum of equipment settling into a steadier rhythm, conversations held in the softer key of people who had just stepped back from alarm. Daniel sat at the small desk under the wall clock and typed the report with a careful hand. His fingers paused over the keys, as if the right phrase might be a hinge that would swing others' decisions. He attached the photo of the monitor and transcribed his notebook entries into the electronic chart. Every time his eyes landed on the screenshot,
he felt the same peculiar tightness, an image that could not be unseen, and a truth that required more than his solitary voice. Nina came by with a cup of tepid coffee and a face that carried the look of someone who had slept, then not really. She set the cup down without comment. "You should go home," she said. "Get some rest. I'll be here for the respiratory consult in the morning." He shook his head. "I want to be here when they talk to the family. I want to hear what they tell them." Nina sat in the chair opposite him and opened her notepad. "You'll get credit in the report," she said. "You did everything by the book. You documented. You didn't make assumptions." Daniel appreciated the sentiment. He knew too that the hospital's language of credit rarely translated into changes. Often it translated into a line in a file somewhere, filed and forgotten.
What mattered to him was different. That the next nurse who saw the tiny nail graying of a fingertip would have a clearer path to speak up and be listened to. At 3 o'clock, Sloan, the nurse manager, called a brief safety huddle in the conference room. It was a utilitarian space, coffee rings on the table, laminated protocols pinned to the wall, where officials spoke a different grammar. The director of patient safety arrived, a composed woman with a folder thick with incident reports and a manner that suggested she lived inside lists. Dr. Harris was there too, his hair flattened, his jaw set in the way men who manage many schedules develop. The respiratory therapist, a quiet man named Greg, folded his arms and set his tablet on the table. Sloan began with the facts, not the drama. Infant Lila Blake experienced recurrent oxygen desaturation events overnight. Nurse Daniel Rivera documented episodes at 0116 and again this morning at 10:34. A screenshot of the monitor strip was submitted. Respiratory responded and recommended an overnight stay with telemetry and a follow-up consult. She looked at Daniel then, not for permission but for confirmation. He nodded, his hands resting on the thin folder where he'd placed photocopies of his notes and the image from his phone. Greg tapped his tablet and pulled up the strip. He wasn't theatrical in his approval. He simply narrowed his eyes, the universal sign of a professional seeing what had been unseen. "These dips are not just artifacts," he said. "They're transient, yes, but repeated dips in a neonate can indicate an underlying tendency toward instability. Given the pattern, the decision to extend observation was prudent." Dr. Harris exhaled. "We were preparing for discharge," he admitted, his voice steady. "The labs were okay. We made a judgment call that would serve most infants well. This case suggests we need a clearer trigger for consultation." The patient safety director nodded. "We need to consider a protocol update that ensures repeated desaturation events, especially when documented by nursing staff, automatically trigger a respiratory consult before discharge decisions are finalized." In the room, policy language began to coagulate. Thresholds, triggers, escalation pathways. Daniel listened as the bureaucratic machinery shaped itself, feeling relief that went beyond his personal vindication. This was what he wanted, rules that made it less likely for another guardian of a life to have to plead a case alone. When the meeting broke, Sloan called Daniel aside. "We'll add your notes and the monitor strip to the safety event," she said quietly. "This will go to the medical executive committee. Good work. Documented, visible. That's exactly what we need." The next morning, the family meeting took place in a small conference room lined with gentle art, pastel landscapes meant to calm lungs and nerves, and a pitcher of water sweating in the middle. Owen sat across from Dr.
Harris and the respiratory therapist, hands folded, as if trying to contain a mixture of indignation and gratitude. Rosa held Leela in a perch that was part possession and part reverence. Leela slept on in the safety of the room's quiet, cheeks finally warm. Daniel stood at the back of the room like someone who had been invited to witness a delicate exchange. He watched Owen's face grow drawn as the clinicians described what had happened, only now with the benefit of the monitor strip's visual logic. The words were clinical: recurrent desaturation, transient apnea-like events, recommended observation, but the tone softened when Dr. Harris paused to address the parents directly. "You were very close to discharge," he said. "If not for the documentation, we might have missed the significance of the pattern. That would have been a different situation." Owen's hand found Daniel's before Daniel could stop it. "Thank you," he said simply, the two words carrying more grief and relief than any long speech could. Rose's eyes filled, and she offered Daniel a smile that was a bridge between two people who had been on opposite sides of an impossible ledger, one who had nearly lost a child, the other who had kept watch. They did not parade him forward. There was no brass band. That was not how these things worked. Instead, they included him in the small rituals that belonged to gratitude,
a note scribbled on a nursing appreciation card, a photograph snapped of Leela asleep with her tiny mitten visible, and later a packet of drawings left for the staff. Before they left, Owen bent and pressed his forehead briefly against Daniel's shoulder in a gesture that made a private kind of thanks public. When the hospital's internal safety bulletin circulated 2 weeks later, Daniel's name appeared in a line that was modest but precise. Case study. Nursing documentation led to timely intervention preventing potential neonatal deterioration. It was a line that, for him, mattered not because it elevated him, but because it elevated the practice of paying attention. The review process was not a pronouncement, but a careful unspooling. Clinicians who had been busy on other tasks read monitors with a new patience. The respiratory group's recommendations were pragmatic: an escalation policy that required respiratory consult after a set number of documented dips, an instruction for mandatory nursing screenshots when trends were suspected, and an educational brief for staff on neonatal rhythm variations and handoff clarity. There was no sensational headline, no dramatic change overnight. Change in hospitals usually happens in increments, small gyrations that add up. But there were also human consequences. Dr. Harris sought Daniel out privately and offered him a handshake that came with a brief, direct apology. "You raised a point and you held to it," he said. "We should have listened sooner. Thank you." Daniel accepted the words without making them a feast.
He had long ago learned that apologies in hospital corridors land with the same ambiguity as compliments. Still, the exchange altered something intangible between them. It unknotted an old strain of hierarchy. Colleagues who had once asked for his patience began to ask for his insights. Young nurses came by his station with clinical questions and a desire to learn his quiet methods for noticing, how he set his ear to the monitor's pattern, the small things he recorded, how he chose when to escalate. He began to lead a brief informal workshop during staff development on observation habits, how to document effectively, what to photograph, how to phrase a note so that a busy attending would pause. Being visible in that way unsettled him. Daniel had chosen nursing for the intimate work of care, not for applause. But he learned to accept a different kind of visibility, one that multiplied safety rather than spotlight. He taught, and in teaching he found a new cadence, an ability to translate the gut sense that had guided him for years into practices other clinicians could use. The hospital's safety committee invited him to speak at a staff meeting. He had resisted at first. Public speaking felt too like performance, but Sloan insisted that frontline voices be present. He prepared 3 points: document, photograph, escalate. He rehearsed the phrases until they felt like facts rather than pleas. When he stood in the fluorescent-lit staff room, his voice was plain and even. He did not ask for praise. He asked for a culture that allowed concern to be expressed without penalty. Afterward, a line of nurses and residents waited, not to praise him, but to trade notes. One resident confessed, "I dismissed it. I didn't want to slow the service. I should have asked more questions." Another nurse handed him a folded card. Inside, in childlike scrawl, the words, "Thank you for saving Leela," and a drawing of a nurse with a cape. Daniel kept the card in his wallet. There were small administrative changes too. The hospital issued a memo that revised the discharge checklist for newborns to include a specific item: consider respiratory consult if recurrent documented desaturation events. It was bureaucratic language, yes, but language shapes action. The memo also encouraged staff to use technology, screenshots, timestamps, to create a paper trail when intuition needed to be translated into decision. Across the city, other hospitals faced similar dilemmas. The story, contained in an internal newsletter that sometimes was read like a gospel among clinicians, sparked conversations in other units. The ripples were modest, but they were real. Daniel's invisible witness had become a lever. Back in the nursery, Leela grew. Week by week, the color returned with steady likelihood. The dips became fewer, and when they came, the team gathered swiftly, socketed into the protocol's muscle memory.
The respiratory consult suggested that Leela might have brief, benign immaturity of respiratory regulation that would improve with time and supportive care. Nothing sinister, no headline-making diagnosis. The family was given a plan that included a home monitor recommendation for the short term and a follow-up appointment with a pediatrician. It was a plan grounded in prudence and hope. The day Leela went home, the nursery felt like the place where a brief war had been fought and won with acts that were mainly patience and watchfulness. Owen and Rosa stood, shuffling papers, smiling with that watery, wary look of people returning from a narrow wait.
Daniel watched them strap the car seat into the back of a sedan, Leela bundled against the city wind, her tiny mitten back in place. Owen crossed the room one last time. He handed Daniel a small envelope. "Open it when you have a minute," he said. Later, in a quiet tapering of a shift, Daniel sat at the station and unfolded the note. Inside was a photograph of Leela in the car seat, taken by the father, and a letter written by Rosa in a looping hand. "To the man who didn't let us go," it read. "We can never thank you enough. You kept watch when no one else did. You are part of our family now." There was a drawing tucked behind the letter, the same crayon figure of a caped nurse. He pressed it to his chest like a medal and felt the oddness of being acknowledged. He had been invisible by design, but the world had shifted enough to give the invisible a foothold in the daylight. Weeks later, the respiratory team followed up with Leela's family and recorded a note that read like the end of an arc. Improved regulation noted, continued outpatient follow-up recommended, no further immediate intervention required. The words meant the immediate threat was past. For Daniel, the work returned to its ordinary rhythm, vitals, rounds, the soft negotiation between efficiency and patience. But something had changed. People who earlier had buffered him from decisions now checked with him. Those tiny acts of attention he taught became informal rituals among the nurses. Carry the tiny notebook, take the screenshot, write the time, speak plainly at handoff. At night, when the hospital's lights dimmed to a softer hum and the nursery settled into the steady breathing of sleeping infants, Daniel would sometimes find himself lingering at a crib and watching fingers curl. He kept the crayon drawing folded into his badge case, and on the days when he felt most invisible, he would glance at it like a small lighthouse. There were moments of awkwardness. Recognition sits awkwardly on people who never sought it. A staff appreciation meeting included a small mention. "This month we recognize a member of our neonatal team whose documentation and vigilance contributed to a positive outcome." There were polite applause and a card signed by colleagues.
Daniel accepted the applause as if he were stepping out of a doorway he had not known was there. He gave a short, measured thanks, and then returned to the work he loved. Not everyone shifted. There lingered a bureaucracy that resisted too many changes at once. Bed capacity pressures remained a daily calculus. Administrators balanced charts and censuses with an eye toward fiscal reality. But the policy adjustment remained in the binder, and that to Daniel was enough. Systems that are mutable eventually yield to the pressure of repeated small truths. Months later, at a routine check-in, Lila's pediatrician typed a brief note that read, "Growing well, no recurrent significant events. Continue to monitor with parental education, encourage regular follow-up." The note closed the chapter with the kind of clinical calm that makes families breathe easier. In the months that followed, Daniel found himself teaching a short module during orientation for new nurses about the importance of translating concern into documented facts. He told them the simple story of what he had done that night, without theatrics. Observe, document, escalate. He emphasized that documentation isn't about winning arguments. It's about offering a chain that others can follow when sightlines differ. The new nurses listened with the kind of hungry attention that makes veterans feel less alone. At home, he carried the day into small domestic rituals. He placed the drawing on the refrigerator next to a photograph of his son, both of which made his apartment feel like a place that kept the ledger of care. His son, 7 and unbothered by invisible heroes, would sometimes ask why his dad didn't wear a cape. "Because the cape would snag on the equipment," Daniel would say, and both would laugh. But he also told stories of the small things that mattered, the pattern of a monitor's breath, the way a hand grows paler and then pinker, the tenacity of people who refuse to be hurried. He taught his son to look for details, the way a neighbor's cat moves, the small kindnesses that pile up into a day's worth of goodness. The public recognition remained modest. An internal bulletin, a quiet nod at a staff meeting, a framed certificate hung in a corridor where staff passing by might glance at its language. The family sent updates. They brought photographs from celebrations months later, a Thanksgiving where Lila had been fed solid food for the first time. Each picture that arrived was a small victory that code and chart could not entirely contain. There were evenings when Daniel replayed the night's moments in his head, watching the monitor dip, the way his hands had moved, the moment when documentation turned the private ache of a gut feeling into a visible object others could see. He thought often of the unpublished stories that never arrive at review boards, small, private rescues that slip by unnoticed. That thought made him both tender and wary.
On a cold afternoon some months later, a small ceremony was held in the staff lounge. It was not a spectacle. A local pediatric nursing association had reached out after reading the hospital's internal bulletin and asked for a brief case presentation.
Daniel, a reluctant public speaker, agreed to summarize the case at a regional meeting. The association sent a small plaque, an emblem of a broader conversation about safety. At the ceremony, Owen and Rosa appeared with Lila perched on Owen's shoulders, a little older, hair and soft tufts. They brought a little book of pictures, and when they presented the plaque, Rosa took Daniel's hand. "You saved a piece of our family," she said, and the words landed like a bell. In that room, a dozen clinicians watched, feeling the way a small act knits into a larger safety net. Daniel did not change because of the plaque. He changed because the culture around him had shifted enough to listen when someone at the bedside said, "I think we should look closer." The plaque sat on a shelf in a communal room and gathered a smattering of dust between shifts, visible but quiet, like the work it represented. Sometimes he thought about invisibility as an asset rather than a lack. Being unseen allowed him to observe without spectacle, to keep a soft focus on the things others often missed in the rush. But he also came to understand that invisibility can be dangerous if it silences the voice that knows what to look for. He held both truths at once, that humility and advocacy are not opposites, but companions. The nursery continued to hum with new lives, with staff who rotated through, carrying their own stories. Daniel moved through the shifts with a steadier gait. New nurses asked questions that he answered not with certainty, but with method. What to document, when to photograph, how to collaborate with a busy doctor without appearing to challenge their judgment. He kept the little mitten and the drawing tucked away in a drawer at home. On nights when he felt the worn edges of the world, too much paperwork, too many balancing acts, he would pull them out and look at them like a map. The mitten was tiny enough to disappear in his palm, and yet heavy enough with meaning to teach him why small things mattered. Years in medicine teach a peculiar patience. Outcomes pile up and flatten into patterns that are hard to trace back to any single night. Yet every now and then a single line of script, an image, a handwritten note, shifts a story's course. Daniel's small archive of that night lived in a folder that could be pulled out for audits, for training, for quiet moments when a colleague needed an example of how attention mattered. One winter evening, after a long shift, he stopped at the nursery to check on a new admission. A nurse hurried by, breathless with a concern, and Daniel watched her move with a sharp readiness. She had the look of someone carrying a slight dread and the tools to turn it into action.
He found himself stepping forward, offering a hand, a conscientious ear, a way to phrase observations so that decision-makers would listen. The moment felt ordinary and miraculous at once. It was the work of 100 nights folded into one. When people called him an invisible hero, a label that made him uncomfortable in a neat way, he thought of the many hands that had kept the machine running, of the quiet work that rarely made it into a certificate. He accepted the title with a modest shrug, and then moved on to the next patient, the next observation, the next small defense of a life. If there is a lesson in the story, it might be simple. Vigilance can be a form of love. It insists that someone will keep watch when others are tempted to move on. It insists upon documenting things that seem small until they are not. It is not romance, but daily fidelity, a patient continuing of attention that over time becomes a safeguard. On a soft spring morning, months after Leela went home, Daniel unpinned the crayon drawing from his locker and slid it into the front of his small notebook. He opened to the page where he had written the exact times and the brief notes, and he let the paper sit between his fingers. In the margin, he made one small addition: share at orientation, observation changes outcomes. He closed the notebook, slipped it into his pocket, and walked into the ward. Somewhere a monitor chimed, a tiny, honest sound that marked life. He paused at a crib, smoothed a blanket, and brushed the hair from a sleeping child's forehead, as if returning a small debt. The hospital continued to turn, an apparatus of protocols, people, and unglamorous dedication. But within its movement, a small practice had been amplified, the recognition that an unseen person can change everything with patient attention, and the courage to make that attention visible. If you have someone in your life who noticed you when others didn't, if there's a nurse, a caregiver, a neighbor who sat awake while you slept, take a moment to say thank you. These are the people whose unnamed vigilance keeps us breathing. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who believes in the quiet courage of caregivers. A simple thank you to a healthcare worker can mean more than a plaque ever will.